let's continue on to part 2 of Chapter 7, Creating and Configuring Virtual Machines. Let's look at allocating additional memory. In the previous section, we created a virtual machine and we allocated a certain amount of RAM. And we allocated that amount because that's all we thought that it needed. But over time, we have noticed that utilization has increased, so what we're going to do is allocate additional RAM to that virtual machine. If I go to the Hyper-V Manager and I select a virtual machine, I will right-click on it and I will select Shut Down, because when we make a modification to RAM, we've got to shut it down. I shut down the virtual machine, and then I right-click on that virtual machine and I select Settings. Now we can see initially this virtual machine was just assigned 1 gig of RAM, and at the time that's all that was necessary. But what I'm going to do is increase that number to 8 gig of RAM. Now I can only assign 8 gig of RAM assuming that there is 8 gig free on this entire physical server, and I know that there is. I will assign it 8 gig of RAM, click on OK. And then if I start this virtual machine, I can see that it has now been assigned 8 gig of RAM. Now let's discuss dynamic memory. But before we discuss dynamic memory, let's look at an example of no dynamic memory. Here's the example. We have a virtual machine which requires 2 gig of RAM just to boot, but it only requires 1 gig of RAM to operate. So typically what you would do is you would assign it 2 gig of RAM so it can boot. But after the virtual machine is running, we see that it only needs 1 gig of RAM, but it's been allocated 2 gig of RAM. So it has an extra gig of RAM, which it doesn't need. And what that does is it leaves less memory for other virtual machines. This is why we have dynamic memory. When we configure dynamic memory, we can assign, for example, 2 gig for the startup memory, and then we can assign just 1 gig of memory for normal operation. So during the boot up, the virtual machine uses 2 gig of memory. But after boot up, the virtual machine only uses 1 gig of memory, and the remaining 1 gig of memory is available for other virtual machines. If we look at Microsoft.technet.com, we will see the Hyper-V Dynamic Memory Overview. And we can see that dynamic memory allows you to increase consolidation and improve reliability for restart operations. If we scroll down, we can see that there are 4 configuration settings for dynamic memory: startup RAM, minimum RAM, maximum RAM, memory buffer, and memory weight. Let's look at each one of those. When we are configuring dynamic memory, the first variable we configure is the startup RAM, and that's the amount needed to boot. In this example, I would allocate 1 gig. And a second variable we configure is minimum RAM, and that's the amount needed for normal operation. In this example, it's only half a gig. And then a third variable we can configure is maximum RAM. And the purpose of configuring this variable is it prevents one virtual machine from taking up all of the RAM in the Hyper-V host. In other words, if we have a virtual machine that's a real RAM hog and it takes more and more and more RAM, the reason we put a maximum on it is it prevents one virtual machine from taking all of the RAM, and then there's none available for any other virtual machine. So I will set the maximum RAM, in this case, to 16 gig. Then we configure the memory buffer. What the memory buffer does, if we set it to 20%, is it allocates 20% more to the virtual machine than it really needs. And that way it gives us wiggle room for increases or for spikes in demand. And then the fifth variable to configure is memory weight. Now this only makes a difference if we are short on memory. If we have more virtual machines than we have RAM. What we can do is we can give one virtual machine a higher priority so it's guaranteed to get the RAM, which of course means that other virtual machines will not get the RAM. This only makes a difference if we are short on RAM. So I will go to my virtual machine and I will right click and select settings. And under the memory configuration variable, we can see that under dynamic memory, you can manage the amount of memory assigned to this virtual machine dynamically within a specific range. So I will click off on the checkbox that says Enable Dynamic Memory. Then I will allocate an amount for startup RAM, in this case 1 gig. Then I will specify the minimum RAM, in this case only half a gig. I will specify the maximum RAM is 16 gig, and that way it prevents this virtual machine from gobbling up all of the memory which is available in the Hyper-V host. And then I can specify the percentage of memory that Hyper-V should try to reserve as a buffer, and I will specify that as 20%. And then the last variable is memory weight. I can set the memory weight or the memory priority to low, medium, or high. This would only make a difference is if I'm short on RAM on the physical machine and I have more virtual machines than I have RAM. So if I give this virtual machine a higher priority and another virtual machine I've assigned a lower priority, then the virtual machine with a higher priority will get the RAM first, and the virtual machine with a lower priority will get the RAM second. And if there is not enough RAM to go around, then the virtual machine with a lower priority is not going to be able to start up. I will leave this set at medium. So when we configure dynamic memory, we configure a minimum, a maximum, startup, and a buffer. If I look at server 3 here and I start it, I can see that the startup memory is 1 gig. The minimum memory is a half a gig, and the maximum memory is 16 gig. If I look up here at file server 2, which has been running for a while, I can see that file server 2 has a startup memory of 2 gig. We can see that dynamic memory is enabled, that the minimum memory is 1 gig, the maximum memory is 4 gig. The memory demand, in other words, how much it really needs, is only 600 meg, less than 1 gig, and it's been assigned 1 gig. The reason it's been assigned more than it really needs is because of the 20% memory buffer. Let's now discuss smart paging. Many of you are already familiar with virtual memory in Windows. It's been around for years in Windows XP, in Windows 7, in Windows 2008 Server. Virtual memory is when your computer is out of RAM, the extra data can temporarily spill over to the hard disk, and then the hard disk emulates RAM. Ideally, this never happens, but sometimes when you're out of RAM, virtual memory is when the extra data temporarily spills over to the hard disk, and this is called paging. Smart paging works in a similar fashion. In smart paging, if there is insufficient memory to boot a virtual machine, then Hyper-V sends the data in memory to the hard disk, and what that does is it frees up memory for a new virtual machine. Smart paging only kicks in if you're short on memory. To configure smart paging, we typically select the fastest hard disk which is possible. So if I go to my virtual machine here and I right click and I select settings, I can see that under smart paging the file location is the C drive. It's the hard disk. Well, I would like this smart paging file to be on a faster hard disk. In this computer, I have an SSD drive, which is an internal solid-state drive. It's a much faster drive. So I would prefer to move my paging file to a faster hard drive, which provides faster paging. Resource metering. Resource metering allows us to monitor the virtual machines. It allows us to determine which virtual machine is using how much memory, how many CPU cycles, and how much hard disk space. To enable resource monitoring, I go into PowerShell, and to enable resource monitoring, I type enable VM resource metering dash VM name is the name of the virtual machine that I want to monitor. I press the enter key, and that simply enables the resource metering. And then to view how much utilization each virtual machine is using, I type measure VM dash VM name followed by the name of the virtual machine. And when I press the enter key, I can see that this virtual machine is using 3 gigahertz of CPU utilization, only 1 gig of RAM, and 40 gig of hard disk space. Chapter 7, Summary. In this chapter, we looked at virtualization overview, installing Hyper-V, using the Hyper-V Manager, creating a virtual machine, installing a guest operating system in the virtual machine, installing guest integration services, adding RAM, configuring dynamic memory, smart paging, and resource monitoring. And this concludes Chapter 7. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.